What's up, everybody? It's Mike Taylor, student.
Get up.
Yeah. Physical therapist. And today I want to talk about one of the most common questions that I get in my DMs, people posting comments. They ask, hey Mike, what do you think about butt wink when I squat? And so one thing I want to kind of point out here, and I think it kind of should set the tone for the whole video, is that most of the time when people ask me about it, I've been asked, so like, what's your pain level like? What sort of activities does it hurt when you do? And they say, oh, well, there's not really any pain. It's just, I noticed this, I noticed butt wink. So we've kind of been conditioned to think that, all flex postures are bad. So it's not surprising that people have these beliefs. I just kind of want to let you know that in our backs, in our bodies, there is a certain range of positions that can be deemed totally normal, and that includes flexed ones. For some people's anatomy, the first thing to just know is that some people may not be able to get to a competition depth squat without a little bit of flexion in the low back, and that is perfectly okay. Now, where we can run into problems is if there's an excessive amount of flexion, or if it becomes a painful issue or becomes an aggravating factor. So today, I'm gonna kind of go through exactly what it is, why it happens, and a couple of things that I would recommend for sort of remedying the situation. So first of all, what is butt wink? At the bottom of the squat, due to a restriction in mobility somewhere else in the body, the low back kind of compensates, and it does this by flexing. So that puts your pelvis in a posterior pelvic tilt, and when that happens, it kind of gives you that last little bit of depth. And as I said earlier, within certain ranges, not a huge deal, not a problem. And even if it's excessive, I wouldn't necessarily be the first to say, oh yeah, that's definitely a problem, unless it is causing you some pain. So there are a couple of reasons that I think this happens normally. First one is just simple motor control. So you gotta be sure that you're doing your squat correctly. You gotta be sure that you're timing all the components correctly. You gotta make sure that your technique is on point. Other reason to happen is just your anatomy. If your femur runs out of room to flex in the acetabulum in your hip joint, the next logical place to get that last little bit of motion is for your pelvis then to kind of rotate backwards, and that's going to kind of elevate your knee so that you can get that last little bit of depth, which is important if you're doing powerlifting competitions. You have to squat to a certain depth. It's not just about comfort for you at that point. And then the other reason that it happens is due to mobility restrictions. Commonly, I would say, in the ankle, kind of like a dorsiflexion restriction. If you're not able to translate the knee forward, you have to then find another way to get your hips down. So we're gonna address all three of those things today. So the first place I'd recommend to look at making sure that you're not squatting with an excessive amount of weight, making sure that your technique is good. So to do this, obviously take some load off the bar. If you can maintain form with lighter weights, but it gets bad when it gets heavier, well, that means you need to spend more time with lighter weights. You're not as strong as you think you are. Other ways that you can kind of work on this, and I love doing these, is with tempo work and with pauses. Both of these things kind of force you to be in positions for extended periods of time, which can be helpful for sort of motor learning the right position, learning how to fire the muscles in correct sequence, just learning how the squat should feel. So, doing some squats at the bottom, halfway up, halfway down, doing some slow tempo work is all going to be very helpful for sort of making sure that you're doing the squat correctly first. So that's the first place you should look. Other thing I'd recommend doing is I'd recommend not fighting your own bony anatomy. Everybody's hips are kind of structured slightly differently, so I would recommend playing with different stance widths, different toe angles, things like that to find what feels most natural to you, but also something that I commonly see, and it's I think like the worst fault possible for squatting to good depth and squatting without butt wink, is that people will a lot of times hyperextend their low back thinking, oh, okay, well if I can just, roll my pelvis forward, then I'll be good when I get to the bottom of the squat. But what happens actually when you do like an anterior pelvic tilt is that your femur is gonna run out of room to flex even earlier than before, and that's gonna cause even more posterior pelvic tilt. So that's the opposite of what we want. I would recommend that you squat with a neutral pelvis and just do the best that you can with what you've got as far as your bony anatomy goes. Maybe you're not gonna look like, one of the Chinese weightlifters who has like, a perfectly upright spine, but that's okay. That's not you. And if that is you, awesome, welcome to the page. What are you doing here? A drill that I've learned that's been helpful for me, sort of like learning how to do my squat descent correctly, just sort of making sure everything's flowing as best as possible. And I forget who I learned this from, so forgive me for not giving proper credit to this. I like to call it like the bottom up squat. And so what you'll do is you'll get in a perfect bottom position. Get in your bottom position. You can hold on to something to kind of help you balance down there. Get in that bottom position, and then what you'll do is you're going to stand straight up, not locking out the hips. At that point, you'll take note of where your hips are in space. How far back did you have to push your hips back before you got to that point. That is kind of how I like to think about doing my squat. So I like to think about kind of pushing my hips back to that point before I really commit to a lot of knee flexion. And then generally that kind of gets me in that position every single time. Last thing I would recommend doing is really working on your ankle dorsiflexion range of motion. So I have a previous video that kind of goes over some ankle stretches, but just a basic calf stretch is going to be good. You're just going to do a lot of it. So I'd recommend doing a straight knee calf stretch and a bent knee calf stretch to hit both the gastroc and the soleus. Also doing some repeated dorsiflexion work, like a loaded lunge with like a lot of dorsiflexion being biased into it is going to be helpful because putting it under load after stretching is helpful for maintaining those changes long term. Also, you could do a heeled weightlifting shoe might be helpful as well. Something I want to be super clear about is that while improving your ankle dorsiflexion can be helpful to an extent, overdoing it and thinking about making your squat a completely quad dominant knees forward squat is also not what we want. If you're doing that, you're basically removing your hips from the equation, and then additionally it's going to cause you to have that early rounding of the back even earlier than before. So I just really recommend against thinking about the squat in terms of absolutes. Everything is going to be kind of on a continuum, on a spectrum, and it's going to be kind of up to you to figure out where on that spectrum you lie as far as optimal leverages go, as far as optimal body mechanics go. So overall, I don't necessarily think that butt wink is the worst thing that could possibly happen to you. So if it's not hurting you right now, and if it's not something that you think is really detracting from performance, I don't necessarily feel like you need to be overly concerned with it. But if you do feel like you want to make some changes, kind of clean up things with your squat, I hope some of the tips that I've given you in this video are helpful for doing just that. Thank everybody for watching. Appreciate all of the comments, questions, and hit me up with anything else you got. I hope that this is helpful for you. As always, everybody, happy training.